Germany, 1945, year zero. Everything from cities to culture lies in ruins. It was time to rebuild. This is the story of a generation of musicians born into post-war rubble who would forge a new musical identity for Germany. Between 1968 and 1977, bands like Neu, Can, Faust and Kraftwerk would look beyond Western rock and roll to create some of the most original and uncompromising music ever heard. They shared one common goal, a forward-looking desire to transcend Germany's past. But that didn't stop the music press in war-obsessed Britain from labelling them Krautrock. Meine Damen und Herren, ladies and gentlemen, willkommen to the sound of Krautrock. In the late 60s, this was what German pop music looked like.
Dandolo, wir sind verliebt, wir sind froh, sag mir, was kann denn schöner sein? Dandolo, wir tauschen nichts dafür ein.
It was known as Schlager, inoffensive, lightweight pop, a world away from what was happening on the streets of West Germany. (1968), the year of a global youthful revolution, and West Berlin was no exception.
There must be some kind of way out of here. Say the joker to the thief.
Like their brothers in the US and the UK, these kids were sick of the man. But in Germany, the establishment had more to answer for.
Businessman there, drink my wine.
Following the German surrender in 1945, the country had been divvied up by the victors. In West Germany, a programme of foreign aid had kick-started the Wirtschaftswunder, an economic miracle that saw the country prosper in the 50s and 60s. But the people running this shiny new Germany were the very same people who had been in power during the war. Nowhere was this more so than in Bavaria, the alpine heart of southern Germany, an area with strong historical ties to National Socialism. Hitler had chosen to start his revolution in Munich, and when not waging blitzkrieg, the Führer could be found relaxing high up in the Bavarian mountains. For Amandul, a group of commune-dwelling musicians from Munich, the past seemed all too present in 1968.
After the war, you couldn't just erase all people or get rid of all people, especially judges, teachers. If they were Nazis, they had to take them because you can't just kick them out and have no teachers at all. It was all still there, but it wasn't as loud anymore. Nobody dared to say Hitler or something like that. The word Jew wasn't there in German language.
Our parents didn't really talk about Hitler, you see, and about the Jews and what this was all about, you know. They were just into silence. Nobody would really talk about it, you know. If I asked my father, he would never say I was a Nazi. If you go to Dachau, which is 30 kilometers away from here, talk to the people there, we didn't know anything about it, you know.
In those days, there were bloody Nazis around all over the place. There was rebellion against them. We had these big revolutionary things in the 60s. All Munich was on the street fighting against police, against politics, against all of that. didn't have guns or the tools to chase them away, but we could make music and we could draw audience, we could draw people with the same understanding, with the same desires.
Amandoul would seek to make acid-drenched, apocalyptic music that soundtracked their vision of a brave new world.
And of course we didn't want to make English music or American music, and we didn't want to make German Schlager music, so we had to come up with something new.
The only thing we could hold on is classical music or the folk. And everything else was from England or America.
We wanted to be international, and we tried very hard not to be Anglophonic and not to be German. So space is one solution.
When you hear Fallus Day, I wasn't really singing. I was more into a voice like an instrument, you see, or doing crazy stuff. Some people get very angry about it. Like my dad did too. He said, well, this is no music.
Amandoul's commune was the locum of radical left-wing politics and music in Munich. Among those who followed Amandoul were the founders of the Baader-Meinhof gang, Andreas Baader, Gudrun Enslin, and Ulrike Meinhof. They thought Amandoul weren't going far enough.
One day, Andreas and Ulrike started, they're not really listening to us and they're not doing the right thing. We actually have to make something drastic, like burn something down or blast something. They burned down this warehouse and got past it, of course, and went to jail. When they got out of jail and they were released, they thought, let's go to our mates, Amandoul.
Once out of prison, Baader and Meinhof would orchestrate a killing spree that made them Germany's most wanted terrorists.
And we were on tour and came back home to Hersching. I went into my room and there was Enslin and Baader laying. And upstairs was Meinhof in Chris's room. And I said, what the fuck are you doing here? You go out immediately, immediately. It was heavy. I didn't like it at all.
It wasn't just the worlds of radical politics and music that collided in the late 60s. One of the cameramen capturing this experimental Amandoul performance was a certain Wim Wenders. Wenders was part of a radical generation of directors reinventing German cinema. The most political of these directors was Rainer Werner Fassbinder, seen here making a cameo in Die Niklaushauser Fahrt, a film that also featured Amandoul. But the most famous young director to emerge was from Munich. Werner Herzog would make films exploring the extremes of the human condition. The soundtracks to his films were written by Popol Vuh, a Munich-based band with close ties to Amandoul. They were led by the late, talismanic Florian Fricker.
Let me see, was heißt denn Menschenswürde? Da ist es, Dignity. In those days, he also had the first work for Agire with Klaus Kinski and Werner Herzog. The reason why they could get together so good, Werner and Florian,
They had been friends. They know each other from the school days, and you know.
Ich bin der Zorn Gottes.
Gerrit, Zorn Gottes. I give you the fact why it sounds so tremendous. You know, it was and the chorale. That's what sounds like the voices. You know, this is a machine that came from Vienna. It was just by accident they found it, you know. It was really helpful. This has nothing to do with metronome. It has nothing to do with playing on the click. We just, our heart, our emotion was the timing, you know, and beautiful. Of course, the real German music, it was the electronic music.
At a time when most of the West was rocking out to guitar gods, something very different was brewing in Germany. Electronic music was virgin, neither tainted by the past nor an Anglo-American import, and in 1968 it was being nurtured in Berlin, a city like no other.
First of all, you have to remember that Berlin was kind of an isolated place. So you couldn't compare Berlin to any other city in the world because there was a huge wall around it.
Yeah, the old days of West Berlin, this was the end of the world. On the other side was Siberia, or at least East Germany, what looks now like a very quiet and peaceful place was the border, and was closely guarded. In case you wonder on which side of the old border you are, these hostile ships are named Eastern Comfort and Western Comfort.
It was a community which had to control more or less himself. So culture and underground, whatever you want to call it, you know, was kind of a very, very specific melting pot. And that was the signature of the city at the end of the 60s.
The key underground venue in Berlin was the Zodiac Free Arts Lab. Founded in 1967, it was a magnet for musicians who wanted to experiment.
Haven't been here in a long time. And this is what's left, a normal cafe. This was quite different 40 years ago.
In the evening they opened the door and we rehearsed on a certain way, but it was also a concert because the audience was there. And this was kind of a center of this whole music, Zodiac Club. So the owner, they said more or less that do what you like here, you know, you can leave even your instruments. We locked the door in the night, you know, and we were playing there every day.
The idea came from a John Cage concert given in an art school in Berlin where he was running about 35 tape recorders, you know, and different sort of sounds and music all over the places. We thought, what a nice idea to have in Berlin a place where you can see that day by day, 24 hours.
It was like the ICA. In New York, it was a factory. It's the same kind of spirit.
The Zodiac was co-founded by experimental artist Hans-Joachim Redelius. Older than most Krautrockers, Redelius' vision drew from his war experience.
I think all my art is based on living, not on doing art. on experiencing life in many, many different aspects. The young part of the Hitler Youth, it was called Pimpfe.
And what did you do in that? What?
We had to do this and all this shit, and to try to make us disciplined following Adolf. I had to wear this Panzerfaust. But I didn't shoot it. I just did try to make us soldiers. But fortunately, the war ended in the right time.
Rudelius formed Cluster. They pioneered ambient electronica.
We bought simple tone generators and a keyboard, and I had a cello as well, just to fiddle around with the sound. I was not able to play the cello at all.
Of course, Achim is more or less the guy who makes little melodies, and I'm the guy who makes more the rhythms and sound things.
A good example for music made by non-musicians. But they had a vision of creating some sort of sonic utopia, a different world with different sounds. This is sort of a promise that there is a way out of the surrounding society.
The majority of Germans, they listen to classic, of course, and Schlager.
Das klingt jetzt grauenhaft. Reinbein. Dieses Mädchen aus unserer Straße hab ich noch immer lieb. Und es gibt einen Grund dafür, dass ich so lang bei ihr blieb.
Yeah, Schlager is stupid text, stupid melody, and everybody loves it. In a way, American hits also are Schlager. Elvis Presley, he was a Schlager singer in a way.
Well, on the surface, Schlager isn't political at all, but that's what makes it political. During the war, the propaganda ministerium, Joseph Goebbels, who was a very modern fascist, he invested lots of money into creating a music industry to his likes. The amount of Schlager broadcasted in the radio program increased dramatically.
Dankeschön. Das war Peter Orloff.
There were not too many ways for a German, let's say, rock musician, you know, to perform music, to develop music, even to think about the theoretical development of music, because there was no heritage in the country. And the Germans were in a very bad situation. We shouldn't forget that. I mean, they were so stupid and guilty for it to start 2 wars and losing it. As horrific as it was, it had one, forgive me to say that, one positive point. There was nothing else to lose. They lost everything. And so when we thought about doing music in a different form, there was only the free form, you know, the abstract form.
Tangerine Dream's electronic symphonies conjured up a different world, far removed from Germany's past. They and other Zodiac acts like Klaus Schulze were among the first to utilize the newly invented synthesizer.
When I started to do my electronic music, the first question of all journalists were, what is a synthesizer? Can you imagine today nobody would even care, they just see hundreds of them. But at this time, what is a synthesizer? Then you try to explain it, you know. And it was so brand new that we thought, oh, that's great, let's try something with it. And that was then the point that we actually, like kids, you know, we were turning knobs without knowing what comes out on the other end, but at least it sounds great. And as far as they are all connected to each other, every knob you move, something is happening, you know, it's so... But don't ask me, I have this now more than 30 years. I could never create tomorrow exactly the same sound.
Munich and Berlin weren't the only centres of experimentation. The real heart of the European electronic tradition was to be found in Cologne, where leading avant-garde composer Karl-Heinz Stockhausen was based.
Cologne was, in the beginning of the 60s, the center of modern music worldwide, you can say. And Stockhausen was one of the composers who was here. And he gave some lectures, and I said to him, I said, Mr. Stockhausen, I can do anything. All examinations I failed. And he said, what do you want to become? I said, composer, of course. And then he looked at me. Your story sounds good. I take you. I heard from an undertaker that in the basement he was doing a side business with thrown out studio equipment from the radio station. And so I entered his shop. The coffins were there. Come with me to my catacombs, he said. And I found sine wave generators Stockhausen had used for the first time. And these filters, I remember them so well, how he was working with it. Stockhausen had married a rich woman, and I thought I'd do exactly the same, and was succeeding, actually. I was going to Switzerland to become teacher, whatever it was, it doesn't matter. And suddenly I was engaged, but instead of taking too much care for the rich girls, there was a guitar player. He wanted to have some lessons from me, and I could see how talented he was. So he finished the school, and we together founded Can. As I said, better a small bird in the hand than a pigeon on the roof.
5 brilliant individuals can combine the influences of the European avant-garde, jazz and minimalism.
Can was founded in '68. That was the year of the kind of student revolutions in Germany. A mental revolution happened at that time. The war was definitely finished, and the old way of thinking had to be destroyed. We did not try to play rock and roll because we knew it's not the thing we are born with, and we have to find our own way.
Key to Can's driving sound was the drumming of Jackie Liebertzeit, who had been Germany's top jazz drummer, until he had an epiphany.
A guy came to me and said, you must play monotonous. So, he said it with the voice and with the expression, so I was quite impressed. So, I don't know, it was a kind of freak. Maybe he had taken a LSD trip or something. He was completely, I don't know, strange. And I started thinking about it. It's to play monotonous. What did he mean, monotonous? So I started to repeat things.
We played live in Munich, had a concert there, which was a sold-out concert. And I was sitting in the afternoon with Jackie Liebertzeit, with the drummer, in a cafe. And suddenly I saw someone coming up the street, in the middle of the street, and were praying to God and getting down to the street and behaving very strange. And I said to Jackie, we have our new singer.
Damo Suzuki and Nomad in the 21st century, traveler, hippie but not really hippie, metaphysical transporter, human being.
I went to Damo and said, "What are you doing tonight?" He said, "Oh, nothing. I don't have anything to do." Like, "Do you want to become singer in a concert?" Sold out. Yes, and where do we make a rehearsal? I said, "No rehearsal. No. You go on stage and then you sing. Don't worry." Damo was first like a samurai, but a very peaceful one. But suddenly, out of nothing, he broke out in an eruption like a volcano, and the people got so aggressive. Oh, let's say about 30 people were left. Among them was David Niven. And they asked him, "Mr. Niven, what do you think about this music?" He said, "It was great, but I didn't know it was music."
Actually, I don't have so much memories because that time I was quite stoned. And that's it.
"30 kilometers north of Cologne on the Autobahn lies Düsseldorf, the Liverpool to Cologne's Manchester. Düsseldorf would give the world Germany's greatest act, but in 1970 you might not have recognized them. This is Kraftwerk's first televised performance. It features Florian Schneider and Ralf Hütter, two classical music students who formed the creative nucleus of the band. Kraftwerk then were a Krautrock band who also experimented with electronics and shared the same vision of German music as their peers.
Ja, für uns war das mehr ein Problem, überhaupt Musik machen zu können in einer Bundesrepublik oder so nach dem Krieg, wo die lebendige Musik, Alltagsmusik verschwunden war, die war ausgelöscht. Und unsere Generation, wir mussten halt wieder von vorne starten.
Ralf and Florian would employ what they would later call Musikarbeiter, music workers.
At that time I was 20 and I was working in a psychiatrist hospital, and there was another guy working the same job, and he was invited to join a band called Krautrock in the studio. He asked me, would you like to join me? And I didn't know the band, and I didn't have anything better going on, so I said, okay, I'll join you. And when I jammed with Alf Hütter, it was so apparent that we both had the same idea for melody and harmony, which was definitely not American, not blues. It was a European music. There's a German expression called Stunde Null, hour zero, and that was more or less my situation. So I was really fortunate to meet those guys at that time.
Ruther and Kraftwerk drummer Klaus Dinger would leave Ralph and Florian to form their own project in 1971 called Neu.
Well, the basic idea of this fast-forward movement, that was already with us when we performed as Kraftwerk. But when Klaus and I started recording the first Neu album, we just had this basic vision. I always lived near water. I lived near water in Hamburg, where I was born, in Munich, right next to the river Isar, in Winslow, on the Bollin, River Bollin, and in Pakistan at the seaside, and Düsseldorf at the Rhine. And I feel very comfortable in water, with water, and it has an effect. I can't really explain it. It's like time. It's something, it has to do with time, the passage of time. And in a way, it's also a picture like of music, moving along. Like the music, there's some parallels.
Boy, to put Neu into words, the drummer was playing in a way that when you listen to it, allowed your thoughts to flow, allowed emotions to come from within and occupy the active parts of your mind, I thought. It allowed beauty. To get there, the guy has somehow found a way to free himself from the tyranny of stupid blues, rock, of all conventions that I'd ever heard. Some sort of a pastoral psychedelicism.
I mean, at that time, it was still a period of leaving the German history behind. That was also part of the story. I mean, the conservative remains of post-war Germany, of Nazi times, was still to be found everywhere. I admired Willy Brandt, for instance. That was a figure I really looked up to. And Neu once played for Willy Brandt. He was for reconciliation of Germany with the Eastern countries, kneeling down in Warsaw, asking for forgiveness in the name of Germany. And that was something that really appealed to my thinking.
Despite combining a spirit of sonic adventure with a desire to transcend Germany's past, none of these bands could catch a cold in their homeland in the early 70s. Germans who liked progressive rock simply bought records by British and American bands. Since the mid-60s, German record companies had been searching for their own Beatles without success. But in 1969, Uwe Nettelbeck, a sort of Teutonic Tony Wilson, was tasked by Polydor to find the electronic Beatles. This is what he came up with. Faust formed in 1971. They came from Wümme, near Hamburg.
Yeah, so Uwe was interested in revolutionary ideas, and he took this opportunity and sold us maybe as the new Beatles, but that's where it ends. He was well aware, and everybody except Polydor was well aware that we were doing experimental stuff. And they gave us a studio which was great, with a day and night sound engineer at our disposition, which was great. We were very privileged. Because of the social situation in the 60s, 70s, there was lots of revolutionary thoughts in the air on all levels. So I guess artists usually are just a mirror of what's happening. And rock and roll was not enough to reflect all the facets of what was happening. So we are very influenced by whatever is around us. So anything that sounds good to us, that looks good, sounds good to us, we would use it. And so it's left to hazard, to chance. Cement mixer, I like it, so I will play it, and I try to go a bit deeper into that. You know, living is art, art is living, life is art. In the village, funny enough, after they had known us, they realized we were quite okay, and we had visit from the locals. I remember one, what you call that, somebody who is simple in the mind, you know, a village idiot. When we would play our music, it would soothe his mind.
While Faust's unusual sounds weren't quite what German Polydor had in mind, they and the other German bands were coming to the attention of foreign ears.
Who do you think you are kidding, Mr. Hitler, if you think we're on the run?
Britain in the 70s was still obsessed by the war. We won, they were still the enemy, and German jokes were part of our everyday culture. And the British music press were not immune. They grouped all the experimental German groups going under the label Krautrock.
So it was good to be called Krautrock. We even made a song like this, you know, Krautrock.
I remember that from my father, that the crowds are coming, you know, that was the word they said because of sauerkraut.
Deutschland, Deutschland, jubelt.
Krautrock, actually, I don't like it so much because it's a kind of insult.
Yeah, watch! Who's this then? Start you, my I'll do the funny more.
Really, it makes me laugh because I don't feel like making krautrock, but of course you could also say it's a terrible name. It's like if the French would say Bosch rock or something like that.
I'm trying to cheer her up, you stupid kraut!
And furthermore, there was no real krautrock scene. The bands came from all over Germany and were not even aware of each other. Perhaps the only personal link between them was Conny Plank, a visionary producer who worked with Cluster, Can, Kraftwerk and Neu. It wasn't all bad though. The interest in Britain translated into foreign record sales. The early to mid-70s was the height of prog rock in the UK, and the krautrock bands fit in nicely. The UK's #1 prog label, Virgin, signed nearly all the krautrockers, and in one case, bit off more than they could chew.
Richard Branson was gambling. So he gambled, he said, let's go to Germany, okay, I gamble on those. You know? And it didn't work with Faust because we still had the same attitude, no compromise. And then he lost interest in us. Or I think we made trouble, but I can't remember really. We smoked too much, I can't remember.
Ja, und wir hatten auch Probleme mit dem Essen, mit den Speisen, den englischen Speisen.
Yes.
Ja.
Yes.
What was the problem?
Well, the food.
Es ist sehr ungewohnt für uns. Es gibt Fleisch mit Pfefferminzsoße und so. Wir wollten unseren deutschen Koch haben. Und vielleicht hat ihn das beleidigt.
Other Virgin bands were more successful. Tangerine Dream became hugely popular in the UK in 1974 after they were invited to play at Reims Cathedral in France.
Beginning of a concert, 6,000 people were in this cathedral where just 2,000 had a chance even to stand, not to sit, to stand. You can imagine how the church did look like when all the crowd went out. So that was such a disaster. And then I got a letter from the Vatican saying because of this, we are not allowed to play in a Catholic church again. Then about 3 weeks later, I got a letter from the dean of the Liverpool Cathedral in England. He heard about it and said, okay, if they don't allow you to play in any of their cathedrals, we invite you to all of our cathedrals worldwide. Coventry was great, you know. We stood in a hotel in Coventry, and I went out in the morning of the concert. At the lobby, there was a newsstand, and I saw a picture of myself. So I read the line. 40 years back, they came to bomb the place. Today, they come with synthesizers.
Eins, zwei, drei, vier.
But the band who would truly break through were Kraftwerk. By 1974, Ralph and Florian had gone totally electronic, ditching the guitar and drums and hiring other Musikarbeiter to work in their famous Kling Klang studio.
This is famous Minthopstraße here, where we are right now at the moment. This is not so interesting for normal people, but for electronic music people, they know what is Minthopstraße because the Kling Klang studio was there. So you can't see much here. It's just some steps. That was the way up through that door. And then to the left was the main entrance to the Kling Klang studio, which is only these two windows. Das war eine tolle Zeit. Germany developed more and more after the war. Everything had to be rebuilt, neu aufbauen, as they built more autobahns, and we could drive longer autobahns and longer and faster, and the engines became stronger, and the cars were more beautiful and more beautiful. young men, which we were in between, could afford, could really buy such cars. And we took a car and went just for fun on the Autobahn. 120, 140, 150, that was fun. We opened the window and we heard or you heard the wind. And we made all of these things music.
In combining a progressive technological vision of Germany with electronic music, humour and romanticism, Kraftwerk had transcended Krautrock. They didn't even look like scruffy krautrockers anymore.
Ralph and Florian became from very elegant and rich houses. They could afford to have handmade shoes. And Ralph and Florian, they rubbed their noses on the windows of shoe shops, you know, where they made for 1,000 Deutschmarks handmade shoes. We wanted to be so different from England, from America. This was why we cut our hair short. We wore elegant suits, which were made for us, you know.
The big one for me was radioactivity. I would go to sleep at night listening to Geiger counter. All it is as they manipulate the wand closer and farther from a piece of radioactive material. I went shopping once for asparagus with Florian Schneider. I met the two of them, and he suggested, he said, well, if you like, it is the asparagus season. I am going to the market to select some asparagus. Would you like to come along? And I said, yes, I would. And we had a very nice time doing that.
Wann werdet ihr so weit sein, dass durch euren Adern statt Blut Strom fließt?
Ich weiß nicht. Der Mensch hat ja sowieso Mikroströme oder so. Wenn man EKG macht, dann sieht man das ja, dass das gar nicht getrennt ist. Das ist nicht irgendwie getrennt vom Menschen oder so. Das ist ein Widerspruch in sich, Natur und Technik. Das fällt für uns irgendwie zusammen. Wir sehen das irgendwie mehr als Einheit.
Wie seht ihr euch selbst bei der Arbeit? Eher als Musiker oder als Techniker?
Wir sind Musikarbeiter. Wir nennen uns selbst Musikarbeiter.
I never felt like a Mensch-Maschine, you know. I was not a music worker. As Ralph always liked and used to explain, I always corrected him afterwards. I'm not Ralph. I don't tell that anymore, you know. I'm not a music worker. It was always fun until the end, you know. But the end is always not so fun. Because it's end, you know, it stopped.
Kraftwerk's complete artistic vision transformed them into the one truly global German band. The same could not be said of their electronic peers, such as the equally pioneering Cluster, who by the early 70s decided it was time to leave Berlin and get back to the country. Rodelius and Mobius took up residence in a 16th century hamlet in Forst in Lower Saxony, where they were joined by Neu guitarist Michael Rutter to form Harmonia.
The first Harmonia album was recorded right here. You see the room on that photo hanging on the wall. It's the inside of the first Harmonia album. Yes, and you see that oven. That was the only way we could heat the studio in winter. You can imagine the cold fingers, cold feet. It's so special to have this view. You look for miles and you don't see any human structure.
In 1974, Harmonia's ambient electronica came to the attention of a British rock star in search of a new direction.
I first liked Roxy music without knowing Brian. And I thought to myself, what a stupid, extravagant guy that must be from the picture, just from the picture.
He came to a concert of Harmonia in Hamburg in '74. It was a very nice jam. And we said to him, come to our place and let's do some real music.
Another 2 years passed before he rang and said, can I come and see you? And that's what he did.
Brian came to our house to learn from us, and we didn't go to him to learn from him. He didn't know what to do really, I think, in this moment. He was at the dead end of a street.
There was not the idea to record an album. We just exchanged ideas, took walks and played ping pong even, and stuff like that. It was a very pleasant stay. And at the end we had, I think, 3 tapes full of music, which Brian took with him. I mean, he brought those blank tapes with him. We were poor, we didn't have blank tapes.
It did really change a lot in our life. But he said to me once in the studio, he said, don't worry, Nobi, you will be rich as well one day. But he still is not right.
He left Forst, and the idea was to continue working together, but that didn't happen. He left to record, I think it was Low with David Bowie.
In 1976, David Bowie started a new career in a new town. Bowie was famous for being in the right place at the right time, and in '76, he knew Berlin was the place to be. Accompanied by Brian Eno, Bowie would record his albums Low and Heroes in Berlin's magnificent Hansa studio.
My memories are that this room has a nice acoustic. Maybe you can listen to it. You can hear this little echo behind my claps. And I think that was what David Bowie liked very much with this big hall by the wall.
The studio's control room, now a bar, looked out upon a watchtower on the Berlin Wall.
I'm quite sure they knew what was going on here. And when we sat in front of this console with a few lamps on top, I just directed one of the lamp lights to the policeman, and David and Tony just jumped down under the console and said, "Don't do that!" And I said, "It's funny, it's a joke, they would never hurt us anyway."
Bowie would assimilate some of the Krautrock vibe on both albums. Side 2 of Low would showcase Eno's cluster influences, and Bowie originally intended to record Heroes with Krautrock musicians.
I wish I could swim like dolphins
David Bowie called me in '77, and that would have been interesting to record with Brian Eno and David Bowie in Berlin, but something went wrong.
You can beat them forever and ever.
He said that those two tracks of Noise 75 were his favorite tracks, Hero and After 8. It's anybody's guess where this the name for that album came from.
Released in '77, Heroes was a big hit for David Bowie. But the real heroes were the Krautrockers.
The funny thing is they're doing something they call Krautrock again. So I have to decide, shall I go there? What I fear is that it's only related to the word Krautrock and not to the music. And even if it's related to the music, it misses the more important part, being Krautrock as part of a social movement. And you can play the records again, but this won't come back.
Krautrock may be over, but theirs is not an unhappy ending. Today, these artists remain as gloriously uncompromising as they ever were. Unlike many of their Anglo-American peers, they have refused to be drawn into becoming establishment figures. There are no knights of the realm here, just happy, experimental musicians.